Have you ever wondered what you would do if someone offered to solve all your problems with one impossible request? Elena Vasquez was about to find out. The eviction notice trembled in her hands as she stood in the cramped office of Vasquez Auto Repair, the business her father had built from nothing now reduced to a pile of threatening letters and past due bills. 26 years old, and she felt like the weight of the world was crushing her shoulders, pressing down until she could barely breathe. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows across the paperwork that represented her family's complete financial ruin. $300,000. The number seemed impossible, astronomical, the kind of debt that swallowed entire lives without leaving a trace. Her father's gambling addiction had finally done what years of economic hardship couldn't. It had destroyed everything they had worked for. Miguel Vasquez lay in a hospital bed 20 miles away, recovering from the heart attack that had struck him down when the loan sharks had made their first visit, and Elena wondered if he had any idea that his weakness had condemned his daughters to a fate worse than poverty. She sank into the cracked leather chair behind the desk that still smelled faintly of motor oil and her father's cologne, fighting back tears that seemed to come more frequently these days. Her younger sister Sophia was 17, a senior in high school with dreams of college and a future that Elena was determined to protect, even if it meant sacrificing her own. The text message from Sophia that morning had been cheerful, excited about some school project, completely unaware that their world was about to collapse around them. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Elena quickly wiped her eyes, expecting another angry creditor or perhaps Mrs. Chun from next door with her usual complaints about the noise. Instead, she heard footsteps, expensive leather soles on concrete, moving with the kind of confidence that belonged to someone who had never worried about money in their life. Elena rose from the chair, smoothing down her grease-stained work shirt, and hoping she looked more composed than she felt. The man who entered the office made her breath catch in her throat, not just because of his obvious wealth, but because of the way he seemed to command the space around him simply by existing in it. He was tall, probably 6 feet 2, with broad shoulders that filled out his perfectly tailored charcoal suit in a way that suggested he was no stranger to physical work despite his obvious prosperity. His hair was dark, styled with just enough imperfection to avoid looking manufactured, and his eyes were the kind of deep brown that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. What struck her most was his age, probably mid-30s, and the way he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. This was not a man who asked for things. This was a man who took what he wanted and dealt with the consequences later. "I'm looking for Elena Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying just the faintest trace of an accent that spoke of Italian heritage and expensive education. His gaze moved over her face with an intensity that made her skin warm despite the chill in the unheated office. "That's me," Elena replied, hating how her voice wavered slightly. She lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of pride that her father's failures hadn't quite managed to destroy. "Can I help you with something?" The man stepped closer, and Elena caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, something dangerous that made her pulse quicken in ways she didn't want to examine. He moved like a predator, all controlled grace and barely leashed power, and every instinct she possessed warned her that this man was not what he appeared to be. "My name is Dante Moretti," he said, extending a hand that Elena found herself shaking despite her better judgment. His skin was warm, his grip firm but careful, as if he was conscious of his own strength. "I believe you know why I'm here." Elena's stomach dropped like a stone. She had been expecting this visit for weeks, ever since the first threatening phone call, but she had hoped against hope that somehow her father's debts would disappear or that she would find some miraculous solution. The Moretti name was whispered in certain circles, always with fear and respect, and Elena realized with growing dread that her father's gambling had attracted the attention of people far more dangerous than simple loan sharks. "I don't have the money," she said quietly, proud that her voice remained steady. "My father is in the hospital and the business is failing. I've been trying to make payments, but—" Dante held up a hand, silencing her with a gesture that was both gentle and absolute. "The payments your father agreed to were never realistic, Miss Vasquez. $300,000 plus interest, to be repaid within 6 months to men who break legs for entertainment. Your father was either very brave or very foolish. He was desperate, Elena whispered, shame burning in her chest. The gambling, it became an obsession. He thought he could win back what he had lost, thought he could fix everything with one big score. Dante nodded as if he had heard the story 1,000 times before. Desperation makes people do things they would never consider under normal circumstances. It also creates opportunities for those willing to take risks. Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. If you're here to threaten me or my sister, if you think you can intimidate us into finding money we don't have, you're wasting your time. I'll call the police. I'll do whatever I have to do to protect Sophia. Something shifted in Dante's expression, a flicker of what might have been approval or amusement. I'm not here to threaten you, Miss Vasquez. I'm here to offer you a solution. Elena stared at him, her mind racing. Solutions from men like Dante Moretti came with prices that were often worse than the original problem. She had heard stories, whispers about what happened to people who became indebted to the wrong crowd, and none of those stories ended well. What kind of solution? She asked carefully, every word measured and cautious. Dante moved to the window, gazing out at the street where Elena could now see a sleek black sedan idling at the curb, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whatever lay within. When he turned back to face her, his expression was unreadable, businesslike, and cold. I need something that money cannot buy, Miss Vasquez. Something that requires trust and commitment from someone with very specific qualities. In exchange, I'm prepared to clear your father's entire debt and ensure your family's safety and financial security. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to process what he was saying. Nothing that men like Dante Moretti wanted came without a terrible cost, and the clinical way he spoke about trust and commitment made her skin crawl with apprehension. What do you want? She asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Dante's dark eyes met hers directly, and Elena saw something in their depths that might have been regret or perhaps simply resignation. I need an heir, Miss Vasquez. A child to carry on my family's legacy and secure my position within certain business arrangements. I'm prepared to offer you a contract, legally binding and financially generous, for you to provide that heir. The words hit Elena like a physical blow, and she had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from swaying. The casual way he spoke about using her body, about reducing her to nothing more than a vessel for his genetic material, made her stomach turn with revulsion and something else, something that felt disturbingly like curiosity. You want me to be your surrogate, she said slowly, trying to wrap her mind around the scope of what he was proposing. I want you to bear my child, Dante corrected, his voice remaining perfectly level. The arrangement would involve you living under my protection for the duration of the pregnancy and beyond, until the child is born and your obligations are fulfilled. Your sister would be provided for, your father's medical expenses covered, and you would receive a substantial sum for your cooperation. Elena shook her head, backing away from him as if distance could somehow make his words less real. This is insane. You're talking about buying a baby, about treating me like some kind of breeding stock. I'm talking about a business arrangement between two adults, Dante replied calmly. You have something I need, and I have the resources to solve your problems. It's a transaction, nothing more. Nothing more. The words echoed in Elena's head as she stared at this man, who spoke of creating life with the same emotional investment he might show in purchasing a car. And yet, even as revulsion churned in her stomach, she couldn't ignore the cold reality of her situation. $300,000 plus interest, to be paid to men who would not hesitate to hurt her and Sophia if the debt remained unpaid. I need time to think, Elena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Dante reached into his jacket and produced a business card, placing it on the desk between them with movements that were precise and deliberate. You have 24 hours, Miss Vasquez. After that, I'll be forced to explore other options, and your father's creditors will be free to pursue collection through whatever means they deem appropriate. Elena stared at the card, expensive paper stock with embossed lettering that spelled out a name and phone number, nothing more. The simplicity of it somehow made the entire situation feel more surreal, as if her life was being decided by a piece of cardboard that probably cost more than she made in a week. When she looked up, Dante was already moving toward the door, his presence somehow both overwhelming and strangely reassuring. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at her, And for just a moment Elena thought she saw something human flicker across his features. For what it's worth, Miss Vasquez, I believe you would be well compensated for your sacrifice. And your child would want for nothing. Then he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive cologne and the weight of an impossible decision that Elena knew would change the course of her life forever, one way or another. Elena spent the night staring at her laptop screen, the glow illuminating her face in the darkness of her cramped studio apartment. Every search result for Dante Moretti painted the same picture, a man who operated in the shadows between legitimate business and something far more dangerous. Real estate empire, import-export companies, charitable foundations, all of it legitimate on the surface, but underneath lay whispers and speculation that made her blood run cold. The articles were carefully worded, full of implications and suggestions rather than concrete accusations. Alleged connections to organized crime families. Suspected involvement in money laundering operations. Rumored ties to politicians and judges who found themselves suddenly wealthy after favorable rulings. But no convictions, no arrests, nothing that would stand up in court. Dante Moretti was either very lucky or very careful, and Elena suspected it was the latter. She closed the laptop as the first rays of dawn crept through her blinds, her decision no clearer than it had been 12 hours ago. The man who had stood in her father's shop had been dangerous, yes, but also strangely respectful in a way that contradicted everything she had read. He could have threatened her directly, could have used her sister as leverage, but instead he had offered her a choice. A terrible choice, but a choice nonetheless. The sound of her phone buzzing against the coffee table made her jump, and Elena's heart sank when she saw Sophia's name on the screen. Her sister's voice was tight with fear when she answered, barely above a whisper. Elena, there are men outside the house. They've been there for an hour, just sitting in their car watching. I'm scared. Elena was already reaching for her keys, pulling on yesterday's jeans and the first shirt she could find. Stay inside, lock all the doors, and don't answer if anyone knocks. I'm coming over right now. The 15-minute drive to her childhood home felt like hours, and Elena's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The small house where she and Sophia had grown up looked exactly the same. Faded blue siding and the oak tree in the front yard where their father had hung a tire swing 20 years ago. But the black SUV parked across the street transformed the familiar scene into something threatening and wrong. Elena parked in the driveway and forced herself to walk calmly to the front door, acutely aware of the eyes watching her from the tinted windows. Sophia met her at the door, 17 years old, and trying to be brave, but unable to hide the terror in her dark eyes that were so much like their father's. They knocked an hour ago, Sophia whispered as Elena pulled her into a fierce hug. Said they were looking for Dad, wanted to know when he was coming home from the hospital. I told them I didn't know, but they just smiled and said they'd wait. Elena felt rage building in her chest, hot and consuming. These men had no right to terrorize a teenager, to bring their threats to a home where Sophia should feel safe. But even as anger flooded through her, Elena knew that righteousness would not protect her sister from the reality of their situation. Pack a bag, Elena said quietly, her mind racing as she tried to think of somewhere Sophia would be safe. Stay with Aunt Carmen for a few days until I can figure this out. Sophia pulled back to look at her, confusion and fear warring in her expression. Elena, what's going on? What did Dad do? Before Elena could answer, a firm knock echoed from the front door, 3 measured raps that somehow managed to sound both polite and menacing. Elena's stomach dropped as she recognized the calculated intimidation, the way these men made even simple gestures feel like threats. Elena moved to the window and peered through the blinds, her blood turning to ice when she saw 2 men standing on the porch. They were dressed casually, jeans and polo shirts, but there was nothing casual about the way they stood or the cold calculation in their eyes. One of them, a heavy-set man with graying hair, smiled and waved when he saw her face in the window. Miss Vasquez, the man called out, his voice carrying easily through the thin door. We'd like to have a word with you about your father's situation. Nothing to be afraid of, just a friendly conversation. Elena's hands shook as she pulled out her phone and found Dante's number, the business card still sitting on her kitchen counter where she had left it the night before. The phone rang twice before his deep voice answered. calm and professional, as if she had called during normal business hours rather than 7 in the morning. "Mr. Moretti, it's Elena Vasquez. The men you warned me about. They're here at my sister's house right now." There was a pause, and Elena could hear the sound of movement on the other end of the line, as if Dante was already taking action. "Are you and your sister safe at the moment?" "For now," Elena replied, glancing toward the front door where the knocking had resumed, more insistent this time. "But I don't think they're going to leave without some kind of answer." "Accept my offer, Miss Vasquez," Dante said simply. "Say yes, and I'll have those men gone within the hour. Your father's debt will be cleared, and your sister will be under my protection." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Every fiber of her being rebelled against what he was asking, against the idea of selling herself to solve problems that weren't even her own making. But looking at Sophia's terrified face, hearing the menace in the strangers' voices outside, Elena knew she had no real choice at all. "Yes," she whispered into the phone. "I accept your terms, but I want guarantees about my sister's safety. She's only 17, and she has nothing to do with this." "Understood," Dante replied, and Elena could hear the satisfaction in his voice even as he maintained his business-like tone. "Stay where you are. Someone will be there shortly to escort you both to safety." The line went dead, and Elena stared at her phone for a long moment, trying to process what she had just agreed to. She had essentially sold herself to a man she barely knew, committed to bearing his child in exchange for money and protection. The magnitude of it felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in movies or books, not to 26-year-old mechanics from working-class families. "Elena, what's happening?" Sophia asked, her voice small and frightened. Elena pulled her sister close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, and trying to memorize this moment before everything changed forever. "I'm going to fix this," she said firmly. "You're going to stay with Aunt Carmen for a while, and I'm going to make sure Dad's problems don't hurt you anymore." Within 20 minutes, the black SUV across the street had disappeared as silently as it had arrived, and Elena found herself staring out the window at a different vehicle, a sleek silver sedan with tinted windows that somehow managed to look both elegant and intimidating. A man in an expensive suit emerged from the passenger seat, his movements precise and professional as he approached the house. "Miss Vasquez," he said when Elena answered the door, inclining his head in a gesture that was respectful but not subservient. "Mr. Moretti sent me to provide transportation. If you're ready, he's waiting." Elena looked back at Sophia, who was clutching a hastily packed duffel bag and staring at the stranger with wide eyes. "Carmen will be here in an hour to pick you up," Elena said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'll call you tonight, okay?" The drive through the city passed in a blur of familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign, as if Elena was seeing her hometown through different eyes. The man driving introduced himself as Marcus, Mr. Moretti's head of security, and his presence was oddly comforting despite the circumstances. He answered Elena's hesitant questions about where they were going with careful professionalism, revealing nothing more than necessary but treating her with a courtesy that surprised her. The building they stopped at was unlike anything Elena had seen before, glass and steel rising into the sky with the kind of architectural confidence that spoke of unlimited budgets and uncompromising vision. The penthouse elevator required a special key, and as they rose silently toward the top floor, Elena felt her stomach drop with something that might have been anticipation or terror. Dante was waiting when the doors opened, dressed more casually than he had been the day before, but somehow no less imposing. Dark jeans and a white dress shirt that looked deceptively simple but probably cost more than Elena made in a month. He studied her face for a moment, as if checking for signs of second thoughts or regret. "Welcome to your new home," he said simply, gesturing for her to step into the most beautiful living space Elena had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below, and the furniture was all clean lines and expensive materials that managed to feel both luxurious and welcoming. "This is temporary," Elena said quickly, needing to establish some boundaries even as she felt overwhelmed by the opulence around her. "Until the pregnancy is confirmed and the child is born. This isn't permanent." Dante nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "Of course. Dr. Morrison will be here this afternoon to conduct the necessary medical examinations." Assuming everything is satisfactory, we can begin the process within the week. Elena's cheeks burned at the clinical way he discussed what would be the most intimate experience of her life. She wanted to ask him about his expectations, about what their relationship would be beyond the purely biological necessity, but the words stuck in her throat. This was a business arrangement, nothing more, and she needed to remember that no matter how her body reacted to his presence or how her mind filled in the spaces between his carefully chosen words. "Your room is down the hall," Dante continued, his tone remaining perfectly neutral. "Marcus will show you around and explain the security protocols. You'll find clothes in the closet, basic necessities in the bathroom. If there's anything else you need, Mrs. Chun will take care of it." Elena nodded, feeling more like a prized possession being inventoried than a person making a life-changing decision. But as Dante turned to leave, she caught something in his expression that made her heart skip unexpectedly. For just a moment, his carefully controlled mask slipped, and she saw something that might have been loneliness or regret before he composed himself again. "Miss Vasquez," he said quietly, pausing at the doorway, "I want you to know that you'll be safe here. Whatever else happens, I give you my word that no harm will come to you or your sister." Then he was gone, leaving Elena alone in a palace that felt more like a beautiful prison, wondering what she had truly agreed to, and whether Dante Moretti was the savior or the captor in the story her life had suddenly become. Elena woke to sunlight streaming through windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, bathing the enormous bedroom in golden warmth that made everything feel like a dream. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot the circumstances that had brought her here, and simply marveled at the luxury surrounding her. The bed was easily twice the size of her old twin mattress, covered in Egyptian cotton sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and the view from the windows showed the entire city spread out below like a glittering map. Then reality crashed back, and Elena remembered that this beautiful prison was the result of the most desperate decision of her life. She was here to provide Dante Moretti with an heir, to sell her body and her future in exchange for her family's safety. The clinical nature of it made her stomach clench with anxiety, but she forced herself to rise and face whatever this day would bring. The closet that Mrs. Chun had stocked was like something from a magazine, filled with clothes that fit her perfectly and cost more than Elena had ever spent on her entire wardrobe. She chose simple jeans and a soft cashmere sweater, trying to maintain some sense of her own identity even as she was surrounded by evidence of wealth she could barely comprehend. The penthouse was quiet when Elena emerged from her room, her bare feet silent on marble floors that were probably heated, though she hadn't noticed the luxury the night before. She found the kitchen easily enough, a spectacular space with professional-grade appliances and more counter space than she knew what to do with. Dante stood at the massive island, dressed in dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, preparing what looked like an elaborate breakfast. "Good morning," he said without looking up from the pan where eggs were cooking to perfect consistency. "I wasn't sure what you preferred, so I made a selection." Elena stared at him, this dangerous man who moved around the kitchen with surprising competence, and felt something shift in her chest. She had expected servants, had assumed that someone with his wealth and power would never dirty his hands with something as mundane as cooking. But here he was, making breakfast for her with the same careful attention he probably brought to his business dealings. "You didn't need to do this," Elena said softly, moving closer to the island but maintaining careful distance. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." Dante glanced up, and Elena caught something in his dark eyes that might have been amusement. "I'm sure you are, Miss Vasquez. But you're under my protection now, which means your well-being is my responsibility." The way he said responsibility made Elena's skin warm despite herself. There was something possessive about it, something that suggested his interest in her welfare went beyond the purely contractual. She accepted the plate he offered, amazed by the presentation that rivaled anything she had seen in expensive restaurants, and tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened when his fingers brushed hers. Over the next few days, Elena found herself settling into a routine that felt both natural and surreal. Dante left each morning for his various business interests, but not before checking on her welfare and ensuring she had everything she needed. Mrs. Chun, his housekeeper, was a quiet woman in her 50s who treated Elena with respectful warmth and seemed genuinely invested in her comfort. Marcus, the security chief, explained the protocols that would keep her safe, the cameras and alarms and procedures that turned the penthouse into a fortress disguised as a home. What surprised Elena most was how often she found herself looking forward to Dante's return each evening. He would seek her out wherever she was in the sprawling apartment, asking about her day and sharing carefully edited details about his own. Their conversations were cautious at first, dancing around the reality of their arrangement. But gradually Elena began to see glimpses of the man beneath the carefully controlled exterior. It was during one of these evening conversations, while they shared dinner on the terrace overlooking the city, that Elena learned about the loneliness that had shaped him. Dante spoke carefully about his childhood, about parents lost in a car accident when he was barely 20, about inheriting responsibilities and enemies in equal measure. He had been forced to grow up fast, to become someone who could command respect and fear in a world where weakness was a death sentence. "I've spent 15 years building something that will last," Dante said quietly, his fingers wrapped around a glass of wine that he barely touched. "But legacy means nothing without someone to pass it on to. The families I deal with, they respect strength and they respect bloodlines. A man without an heir is a man planning his own obsolescence." Elena studied his profile in the fading light, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his eyes seemed focused on something far beyond the city sprawl. She wanted to ask him about love, about whether he had ever considered finding someone he cared about instead of making a business arrangement for a child. But the question felt too intimate, too presumptuous for someone who was essentially an employee with very specific duties. The medical examination Dr. Morrison conducted 3 days after Elena's arrival confirmed what they had both expected. She was healthy, fertile, and genetically compatible for conception. The clinical language the doctor used made Elena feel like livestock being evaluated for breeding, but she endured the tests and procedures with as much dignity as she could muster. That evening, Dante approached her as she stood on the terrace, staring out at the lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. His presence behind her was warm and solid, and Elena felt her body respond to his nearness in ways she had been trying to ignore. "Dr. Morrison says we can proceed whenever you're ready," Dante said quietly, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been uncertainty. Elena turned to face him, acutely aware of the space between them and the way the evening air seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the point where their clinical arrangement would become intensely personal. "Now," she said simply, meeting his eyes directly, "let's get this over with." Something flickered across Dante's features, an expression Elena couldn't quite read. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step away, and cupped her cheek with one large hand. His skin was warm and slightly rough, and Elena found herself leaning into the contact before she could stop herself. "This doesn't have to be something to endure," he said softly, his thumb stroking gently across her cheekbone. "We can take our time, make sure you're comfortable." Elena's breath caught at the tenderness in his voice, at the way he was looking at her, as if she mattered beyond her biological function. She had steeled herself for something mechanical and embarrassing, but the heat in his dark eyes suggested something entirely different. When Dante kissed her, it was nothing like Elena had expected. His lips were soft and warm, moving against hers with a patience that spoke of genuine desire rather than obligation. She found herself responding without conscious thought, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, where she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The transition from the terrace to his bedroom happened gradually, each step giving Elena the opportunity to change her mind, to retreat to the safety of their business arrangement. But she found herself following willingly, caught up in the discovery that this man who commanded fear and respect could touch her with such careful reverence. Dante's bedroom was as luxurious as everything else in the penthouse, but Elena barely noticed the expensive furnishings as he drew her down onto the massive bed. His hands were gentle as they explored her body, his mouth trailing kisses along her throat that made her shiver with unexpected pleasure. When he whispered her name against her skin, it sounded like worship rather than transaction. Elena had expected the experience to be awkward and clinical, something to be endured for the sake of their agreement. Instead, she found herself lost in sensations she hadn't known were possible, in the way Dante seemed determined to bring her pleasure before taking his own. When he moved over her, his eyes never leaving her face, Elena felt a connection that went far beyond the physical act they were performing. Afterwards, as they lay tangled in sheets that smelled of expensive detergent and something uniquely masculine, Elena struggled to process what had just happened. The arrangement was supposed to be simple, straightforward, but the way Dante held her against his chest suggested complications neither of them had anticipated. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his fingers stroking through her hair with a gentleness that made her chest ache. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She had expected to feel used, diminished by what they had done, but instead she felt cherished in a way that terrified her with its implications. This was supposed to be about money and obligation, not about the way her heart raced when he looked at her or the way his touch made her feel beautiful and desired. It was the next morning that Elena learned their intimate arrangement had consequences beyond the potential for pregnancy. She woke to find Dante already gone, but Mrs. Chen's tight expression and Marcus's increased vigilance told her something had changed overnight. There was an incident at one of Mr. Moretti's warehouses, Marcus explained when Elena asked about the additional security personnel who seemed to have appeared from nowhere. "Nothing for you to worry about, but we're being extra cautious for a few days." Elena wasn't naive enough to believe his reassurances, especially when she noticed the way Dante's jaw tightened when he returned that evening. His greeting was as warm as ever, but there was tension in his shoulders and a hardness in his eyes that spoke of problems beyond the usual scope of legitimate business. It was only when she overheard part of a phone conversation that Elena began to understand the true scope of the danger she had entered. Dante was speaking in rapid Italian to someone, his voice low and furious, but Elena caught enough to realize that their arrangement had made her a target for his enemies. "She's under my protection," Dante was saying, his tone carrying a lethal edge that made Elena's blood run cold. "Anyone who touches her will answer to me personally." When he found her listening in the hallway, Dante's expression shifted from fury to something that might have been regret. He ended the call and approached her slowly, as if she were a frightened animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "There are people who see my need for an heir as a weakness to exploit," he said quietly, his hands coming up to frame her face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the violence she had heard in his voice moments before. "They think they can get to me through you." Elena felt fear clench in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by something else, something that felt dangerously like caring. The thought of Dante being hurt because of their arrangement, of his enemies using her as a weapon against him, filled her with an unexpected fierce protectiveness. "Maybe I should leave," Elena said, though the words felt like glass in her throat. "If I'm putting you in danger." Dante's grip on her face tightened, and Elena saw something raw and desperate flicker in his eyes. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I can protect you, protect us both. But I need you to trust me." Elena stared into his dark eyes and realized with dawning horror that somewhere in the space between their clinical arrangement and their surprisingly passionate night together, she had started to fall for this dangerous man who spoke of protection and legacy while building walls around his heart. The smart thing would be to maintain her emotional distance, to remember that she was here for business reasons and nothing more. But as Dante held her gaze, his thumb stroking gently across her cheek, Elena found herself nodding agreement to a trust that went far beyond their original contract. She was no longer just carrying his potential child. She was falling for the man himself, and that realization was more terrifying than any external enemy could ever be. "I trust you," Elena whispered, and meant it more than she had ever meant anything in her life. Elena stared at the positive pregnancy test for the third time in 10 minutes, her hands trembling as she tried to process the magnitude of what the small pink lines meant. 6 weeks had passed since that first night with Dante, weeks filled with a domesticity that had begun to feel dangerously natural, and now their arrangement had achieved its biological purpose. She was carrying Dante Moretti's child. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow, making her sink onto the marble edge of the massive bathtub as she tried to catch her breath. This was what she had agreed to, what they had both wanted from a practical standpoint, but somehow Elena had not been prepared for the flood of emotions that accompanied the confirmation. Fear, excitement, protectiveness, and something else, something that felt suspiciously like joy, all warred in her chest as she imagined the life growing inside her. A soft knock on the bathroom door interrupted her spiraling thoughts, and Dante's voice carried through the thick wood with a note of concern that had become increasingly common over the past week. "Elena, are you all right? You've been in there for quite a while." Elena quickly stuffed the test back into its packaging, hiding the evidence of what would change everything between them. She opened the door to find Dante leaning against the frame, dressed casually in jeans and a gray sweater that made his dark eyes seem even more intense. The concern in his expression shifted to sharp attention when he saw her face, and Elena realized she was doing a poor job of hiding her emotional turmoil. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, reaching out to touch her cheek in a gesture that had become second nature over the past weeks. "You look pale." Elena met his eyes and saw her own mix of anticipation and anxiety reflected there. Despite the clinical nature of their arrangement, Dante had been watching for signs of pregnancy with an intensity that spoke of genuine investment beyond the purely business aspects of their relationship. "I need to tell you something," Elena said softly, stepping back into the bedroom where morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She perched on the edge of the bed, needing the support as her knees felt suddenly weak. Dante followed, his movements careful and controlled, but Elena could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands clenched slightly at his sides. He settled into the chair across from her, maintaining distance as if he understood that this moment required space for whatever she was about to reveal. "I'm pregnant," Elena said simply, the words hanging in the air between them like a bridge they would either cross together or watch burn. Dante went completely still, and Elena watched as a dozen different emotions flickered across his features in rapid succession. Relief, satisfaction, something that looked like genuine happiness, and underneath it all, a vulnerability that made her chest ache with unexpected tenderness. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of wonder that he couldn't quite suppress. Elena nodded, pulling the test from where she had hidden it and holding it out like evidence of their shared future. "Dr. Morrison confirmed it this morning. Everything looks normal and healthy." Dante rose from the chair and crossed to where she sat, taking the test with hands that weren't quite steady. When he looked up at her, Elena saw something in his eyes that took her breath away, a joy so profound and unguarded that it transformed his entire face. "Thank you," he said simply, sitting beside her on the bed and reaching for her hand. His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and solid and somehow promising. "You've given me something I never thought I could have." Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, surprised by the emotion in his voice and the way his happiness seemed to resonate in her own chest. This was supposed to be a business transaction, a practical solution to mutual problems, but the way Dante was looking at her made it feel like something much more significant. The next few days passed in a blur of appointments and preparations as Dr. Morrison confirmed the pregnancy's viability and began the careful monitoring that would continue for the next 8 months. Elena found herself the focus of Dante's intensified protectiveness, with additional security measures that seemed excessive until she remembered the enemies who saw her as a weakness to exploit. It was during this heightened period of caution that Dante announced they would be dining with his extended family, a gathering Elena had been dreading since the pregnancy was confirmed. She understood the political necessity of introducing her to the people who formed the backbone of his various business enterprises, but the prospect of being evaluated and judged by strangers made her stomach clench with anxiety. The restaurant Dante chose was elegant and exclusive, the kind of place where Elena would never have been able to afford a meal before their arrangement changed her circumstances. As they were escorted to a private dining room, Elena caught sight of the family members already assembled and felt her nervousness intensify. There were perhaps a dozen people present, ranging from Dante's age down to what appeared to be teenage cousins, all of them sharing the kind of understated wealth that spoke of old money and carefully maintained power. The women were impeccably dressed and perfectly groomed, while the men carried themselves with the same quiet authority that Elena recognized in Dante. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Elena Vasquez," Dante said as they entered the room, his hand settling possessively on the small of her back. "She'll be staying with me for the foreseeable future." The introductions that followed were polite but cool, and Elena quickly realized that news of their arrangement had preceded them. She caught knowing looks and carefully neutral expressions that suggested these people saw her exactly as she feared they would, as hired help performing a very specific service for their powerful relative. Dante's aunt, a sharp-eyed woman named Francesca who seemed to function as the family matriarch, was the most direct in her assessment. "So you're the young woman who's agreed to provide Dante with an heir," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How practical of both of you." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks at the casual dismissal, the way Francesca spoke about her, as if she were a piece of equipment rather than a person. She opened her mouth to respond, but Dante's voice cut through the tension with a coldness that made the entire room fall silent. "Elena is carrying my child," he said, his tone carrying the kind of lethal quiet that Elena had heard when he dealt with business threats. "She is under my protection and will be treated with the respect due to someone in her position. Is that understood?" The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Elena watched as expressions changed from dismissive to carefully respectful, as if Dante's words had redrawn the social boundaries in ways that couldn't be ignored. Francesca's smile became genuinely warm, and the conversation that followed included Elena as a valued participant rather than a tolerated presence. Over dinner, Elena found herself genuinely enjoying the company of people who began treating her as family rather than employee. Dante's cousins shared embarrassing childhood stories, and his uncle Roberto discussed his legitimate business ventures with an enthusiasm that made Elena forget about the darker aspects of their world. But it was the way Dante watched her throughout the evening that made Elena's pulse quicken with something dangerously close to hope. He looked at her not like a business partner or temporary arrangement, but like someone he was proud to have beside him. When she laughed at Roberto's terrible jokes or asked thoughtful questions about family history, Elena caught Dante smiling with a warmth that had nothing to do with their contractual obligations. The evening was winding down when Elena excused herself to use the restroom, needing a moment to process the unexpected acceptance she had found among Dante's family. The restaurant's ladies' room was elegant and quiet, and Elena took her time refreshing her appearance and trying to understand the complex emotions swirling in her chest. She was about to return to the dining room when the lights suddenly went out, plunging the restroom into complete darkness. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside, too many feet moving with purpose rather than casual movement. The door burst open before Elena could react, and hands grabbed her arms with painful force, dragging her from the restroom despite her attempts to scream for help. A cloth was pressed over her mouth and nose, smelling of something chemical and sweet, and Elena felt consciousness slipping away even as she fought against her captors. Her last coherent thought was of Dante, of the way he had looked at her during dinner, and the desperate hope that he would find her before it was too late. Elena woke to darkness and the sound of her own ragged breathing, her head pounding and her mouth dry from whatever drug they had used to subdue her. She was lying on what felt like a concrete floor, her hands zip-tied behind her back and her ankles bound together with rough rope. The space around her smelled of motor oil and dampness, suggesting some kind of warehouse or garage far from the elegant restaurant where she had been taken. Fear clawed at her throat as Elena tried to assess her situation, but underneath the terror was something else, a fierce protectiveness for the life growing inside her that gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Whatever these people wanted from Dante, whatever leverage they thought she represented, Elena was determined to survive for the sake of her child. The sound of approaching footsteps made Elena force herself to remain still, pretending unconsciousness while she tried to gather information about her captors. Two men were speaking in low voices, their words carrying just enough for her to understand that they were waiting for something, some kind of confirmation before proceeding with whatever they had planned. "We grab her, we get Moretti's attention," the first man was saying, his voice rough with the kind of casual violence Elena associated with the worst kind of criminals. "He'll come running to save his little breeding mare, and then we take them both out." Elena's blood turned to ice at the crude reference to her pregnancy and the implication that Dante would be walking into a trap. These men had underestimated him if they thought he would come alone or unprepared, but they had also underestimated the lengths he would go to in order to protect what belonged to him. The sound of distant gunfire made Elena's captors curse and scramble for weapons, and she realized with a surge of hope and terror that Dante had found her. The concrete floor vibrated with the sound of vehicles arriving at speed, and Elena could hear shouting in multiple languages as what sounded like a small war erupted outside the building. When the warehouse doors exploded inward with enough force to shake dust from the rafters, Elena saw Dante silhouetted against the lights outside like an avenging angel. He moved through the space with deadly precision, flanked by men who operated with the same lethal efficiency. The confrontation was brief and brutal, ending with Elena's captors either dead or fled into the night. Dante reached her within seconds, his hands gentle as he freed her from the zip ties and rope, his face a mask of fury and concern that made Elena's heart clench with emotion she couldn't name. His fingers shook as he checked her for injuries, and when he was satisfied that she was physically unharmed, he pulled her against his chest with a desperation that spoke of genuine terror at the thought of losing her. "Are you hurt?" he whispered against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "Did they touch you? Did they hurt the baby?" Elena shook her head, clinging to him with equal desperation as the reality of what had almost happened crashed over her. "I'm okay," she managed to say, though her voice was barely steady. "We're okay." In the car ride back to the penthouse, with Elena wrapped in Dante's jacket and his arm around her shoulders, she found herself examining the terror she had seen in his eyes. This man who commanded respect and fear had been genuinely frightened at the thought of losing her, and that realization forced Elena to confront feelings she had been trying to ignore. She was falling in love with Dante Moretti, and if the way he held her now was any indication, her feelings might not be entirely one-sided. That night, as they lay together in the safety of his bedroom with additional security posted throughout the building, Elena felt Dante's hand settle protectively over her still flat stomach. The gesture was unconscious and tender, and it made her chest ache with the complexity of their situation. "I love you," Dante said quietly into the darkness, the words so soft Elena almost thought she had imagined them. "I know that wasn't part of our arrangement, and I know it complicates everything, but I needed you to know." Elena turned in his arms, studying his face in the dim light filtering through the windows. The vulnerability in his expression was almost painful to witness. This powerful man laying his heart bare despite the professional distance they were supposed to maintain. "I love you too," Elena whispered back, the admission feeling like both a relief and a catastrophe. "But I don't know if what we're feeling is real or just circumstance, proximity and danger making us think we care more than we actually do." Dante's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking gently across her skin in a gesture that had become achingly familiar. "Does it matter?" he asked softly, his dark eyes searching hers. "If it feels real to us, if it makes us want to protect each other and build something together, does the origin really matter?" Elena didn't have an answer for that, couldn't untangle the practical from the emotional in a situation that defied every rule she had thought governed human relationships. But as Dante kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of genuine devotion rather than obligation, Elena found herself hoping that what they had built between them was strong enough to survive the scrutiny of daylight and the passage of time. Tomorrow would bring new questions and complications, but tonight Elena allowed herself to believe that love could grow from the strangest circumstances and that the child she carried might be born into something much more beautiful than a business arrangement. Elena woke to the sound of raised voices in Dante's office, the urgent Italian phrases carrying through the penthouse despite the thick walls designed to muffle such conversations. 3 weeks had passed since the kidnapping attempt, weeks of heightened security and careful monitoring that had begun to feel suffocating despite her growing appreciation for the man who orchestrated her protection. She padded barefoot down the hallway, her hand unconsciously settling over the slight curve of her belly where their child grew stronger each day. The pregnancy was progressing beautifully according to Dr. Morrison, but Elena could see the strain it placed on Dante, the way every threat assessment now included calculations about her vulnerability and the baby's safety. The office door was slightly ajar, and Elena could hear Marcus speaking in the clipped tones he used when delivering particularly bad news. "The Romano and Castellano families have formed an alliance," he was saying, his voice tight with concern. "They're moving against all you're holding simultaneously, trying to force you into a position where you'll have to choose between business interests and personal protection. Elena's blood chilled as she recognized the names. Both families with reputations for brutality that made them dangerous enemies, even for someone with Dante's resources. She pressed closer to the door, needing to understand the scope of the threat that seemed to be escalating beyond anything they had faced before. They know about the pregnancy, another voice added, someone Elena didn't recognize, but whose presence in Dante's private office suggested significant authority. They're counting on your emotional investment in the girl and the baby to make you careless, to force mistakes they can exploit. The clinical way the unknown man referred to her and their child as leverage made Elena's hands clench into fists, but it was Dante's response that made her heart nearly stop beating. Then perhaps it's time to consider relocating Elena somewhere they can't reach her, Dante said, his voice carrying the flat tone he used when making difficult business decisions. Somewhere completely isolated until this situation is resolved and our enemies are eliminated. Elena felt the world tilt around her as she processed what he was suggesting. After everything they had shared, after the love they had declared and the partnership she had thought they were building, Dante was prepared to hide her away like a prized possession rather than trust her to stand beside him. Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably. With respect, sir, that might be exactly what they want. If you're distracted by concern for her safety, if you're operating from a defensive position rather than offensive. The suggestion hung in the air, and Elena realized that Dante's associates understood what he seemed to have forgotten, that protecting her by isolating her would ultimately make them both more vulnerable. But before anyone could respond, Elena pushed open the office door and stepped into the room, her chin lifted in defiance despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, meeting Dante's startled gaze directly. The three men turned to stare at her, varying degrees of surprise and concern flickering across their faces. Dante rose from behind his desk, his expression shifting from surprise to the kind of protective authority Elena had learned to recognize. "Elena, you shouldn't be listening to this. These are business matters that don't concern you." The dismissal stung more than any physical blow could have, and Elena felt anger surge through her chest like a cleansing fire. "Don't concern me? They're using me and our baby as weapons against you, planning to hurt us both to get to you. And you think it doesn't concern me?" Dante moved around the desk, his hands reaching for her in a gesture meant to comfort. But Elena stepped back, needing the distance to make her point without being distracted by his touch. "You want to ship me off to some safe house, to lock me away while you handle the dangerous work," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "That makes me a burden, Dante. It makes me something you have to protect instead of someone who can stand beside you." The other men in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unused to witnessing such personal confrontations in what was normally a space reserved for business strategy. But Elena was beyond caring about protocol or propriety. "I didn't agree to be your prisoner," she said, her eyes never leaving Dante's face. "I agreed to bear your child, but somewhere along the way this became about love and partnership. If you want me hidden away until it's convenient to retrieve me, then we're back to the original arrangement, nothing more than a business transaction." Dante's face went pale at her words, and Elena saw something that looked like panic flicker in his dark eyes. "You don't understand the level of danger we're facing," he said urgently. "These families, they won't hesitate to hurt you, to hurt the baby, to make me watch while they destroy everything I care about." "Then let me help you stop them," Elena replied, stepping closer despite her earlier retreat. "I'm not some fragile doll that will shatter at the first sign of conflict. I grew up in the real world, Dante. I know how to be strong when I need to be." Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. "Sir, if I may, the lady has a point. Keeping her close, within our security perimeter, might actually be safer than trying to transport her to a remote location. And frankly, we could use your complete focus for what's coming." Dante stared at Elena for a long moment, his internal struggle visible in the tension around his eyes and the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion that he didn't try to hide. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you and our child more than my own life, and the thought of anything happening to you terrifies me in ways I didn't know were possible. If hiding you away means keeping you safe, then that's what I'll do." even if it means you hate me for it. Elena felt her anger soften at the raw vulnerability in his confession, but she didn't allow it to change her resolve. I love you too, she said quietly. That's exactly why I won't let you face this alone. We're partners now, Dante, or we're nothing at all. The crisis came 2 days later, swift and coordinated as their enemies had promised. Elena woke before dawn to the sound of alarms and running footsteps, the penthouse transforming from sanctuary to fortress as Dante's security team moved with practiced efficiency. Through the bedroom windows, she could see vehicles surrounding the building, dark shapes that suggested this confrontation would be decisive one way or another. Dante was already dressed and armed when Elena emerged from the bedroom. His face set in the cold mask she had learned meant he was preparing for violence. But when he saw her, something human flickered across his features, and he crossed to pull her into his arms with desperate intensity. Stay in the safe room, he said against her hair, his voice rough with fear and determination. No matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes, don't come out until I come for you personally. Elena pulled back to meet his eyes, seeing the love and terror warring in their depths. Come back to me, she said simply. Come back to us. The battle that followed was brief but devastating, the sound of gunfire and shouting echoing through the building as Dante and his men systematically eliminated the threat that had been building for months. Elena waited in the reinforced room, her hands protective over her growing belly, listening to the sounds of her future being decided in violence and strategy. When Dante finally came for her, his clothes torn and blood on his hands that she hoped belonged to someone else, Elena threw herself into his arms with relief so profound it made her knees weak. The enemies who had threatened their family were gone, eliminated with the kind of decisive brutality that reminded Elena exactly what kind of man she had chosen to love. It's over, Dante whispered against her hair, his arms tightening around her as if he could absorb her into his very bones. They're all gone, and no one will threaten you or our child ever again. Elena pulled back to study his face, noting the exhaustion and the lingering edge of violence that would probably always be part of who he was. Are you all right? She asked, her hands gentle as she checked him for injuries. Now I am, Dante replied, his smile transforming his entire expression. Now that I know you're safe, that we're all safe, I am. As they stood together in the aftermath of the storm that had threatened to destroy everything they had built, Elena realized that this was what partnership truly meant. Not hiding from danger or being protected like a possession, but facing threats together and emerging stronger on the other side. Their love had been tested by fire and survived, and their child would be born into a family forged in crisis and strengthened by choice. 3 months after the final elimination of their enemies, Elena stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dante's penthouse office, her hand resting on the pronounced curve of her belly where their child moved with increasing vigor. The view of the city below looked different somehow, less like a landscape of danger and more like a kingdom they had fought to protect together. The legitimate side of Dante's business empire had expanded considerably since Elena began taking an active role in operations, her mind for numbers and natural organizational skills proving invaluable in ways that surprised them both. She had discovered a talent for negotiation that complemented Dante's more direct approach, and their partnership extended far beyond the personal into the professional realm that would be their child's inheritance. Dante entered the office carrying 2 cups of the herbal tea Dr. Morrison had recommended, his movements carrying the relaxed confidence of a man who no longer had to constantly watch for threats. The tension that had marked his shoulders for years had finally eased, replaced by a contentment that made him look younger despite the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair. The monthly reports look excellent, Elena said, accepting the tea gratefully as she settled into the chair he had moved to his office specifically for her comfort. The real estate acquisitions are performing better than projected, and the charitable foundation is exceeding all our goals for community investment. Dante smiled as he took his place behind the desk, though Elena noticed he had positioned his chair so he could see her clearly while they worked. Our goals, he repeated, and Elena heard the satisfaction in his voice at the casual way she claimed ownership of their shared enterprises. Our goals, Elena confirmed, meeting his eyes directly. This is as much mine now as yours, isn't it? More yours than mine in many ways, Dante replied quietly, his expression growing serious in a way that made Elena's pulse quicken with anticipation. Which brings me to something I've been wanting to discuss with you. Elena set down her teacup, noting the nervous energy that had entered Dante's demeanor despite his attempts to appear calm. In the months since their relationship had evolved beyond mere arrangement, she had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when he was preparing to address something of profound importance. Dante rose from his chair and moved around the desk, his movements careful and deliberate as he approached where she sat. When he dropped to one knee beside her chair, Elena's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. "Elena Vasquez," Dante said, his voice carrying a formality that was undercut by the emotion flickering in his dark eyes. "You came into my life as a solution to a problem, but you became the answer to questions I didn't even know I was asking." Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she watched this powerful man humble himself before her. The gesture made more meaningful by the fact that he chose to make it rather than being forced by circumstance or obligation. "You've given me love when I thought I was incapable of inspiring it," Dante continued, his hand reaching out to cover hers where it rested on her pregnant belly. "You've given me partnership when I thought I was destined for isolation. You've given me hope for a future I want to build rather than simply endure." Elena's free hand came up to touch his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of his skin and the warmth that had become so familiar over the past months. The love in his expression was so profound it took her breath away, all the more precious for being freely chosen rather than contractually obligated. "Will you marry me?" Dante asked, producing a ring that was elegant and beautiful but not ostentatiously expensive, chosen for her preferences rather than status symbols. "Not because of our arrangement or the child you're carrying, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice in trusting me with your heart." Elena felt a laugh bubble up through her tears as she nodded enthusiastically, unable to form words through the overwhelming emotion that threatened to choke her. When Dante slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place, completing a picture she had never dared to imagine for herself. "Yes," Elena finally managed to whisper, pulling him up so she could kiss him with all the love and gratitude that filled her heart to overflowing. "Yes, absolutely yes." The wedding 3 weeks later was intimate but elegant, held in the garden of Dante's estate with only family and closest friends in attendance. Elena wore a dress that accommodated her growing belly while making her feel beautiful and cherished, and Sophia served as her maid of honor, radiant with happiness for the sister who had sacrificed so much to protect her future. Elena's father, recovered from his heart attack and deeply ashamed of the circumstances that had brought his daughter to this point, walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes and gratitude in every step. The gambling addiction that had nearly destroyed their family had been replaced with therapy and purpose, Miguel finding redemption in honest work at one of Dante's legitimate businesses. Dante's family, who had initially viewed Elena with skepticism, now embraced her with genuine warmth that spoke of respect earned rather than position granted. When Francesca kissed her cheek and whispered that she had never seen Dante so happy, Elena felt the last of her concerns about acceptance finally fade away. The ceremony itself was conducted in both English and Italian, acknowledging the cultural blend that would define their marriage and their child's heritage. When Dante spoke his vows, promising to love and protect Elena not as a possession but as a partner, Elena felt the final transformation of their relationship from arrangement to authentic commitment. By the time they exchanged rings and were pronounced husband and wife, Elena understood that what they had built together was stronger than anything born from simple attraction or convenience. They had chosen each other repeatedly, in crisis and in peace, and that choosing would continue every day for the rest of their lives. The months that followed passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation as their child's arrival approached. Elena continued to work closely with Dante on the business enterprises, her growing expertise in finance and operations making her an invaluable partner in the expansion of their legitimate holdings. The nursery they prepared together was a testament to hopes and dreams that had grown far beyond the original scope of their arrangement. Sophia thrived at the prestigious university that Dante's generosity had made possible, calling weekly with updates about her studies and her growing confidence in a future that no longer seemed limited by financial constraints. Her gratitude toward Dante was profound but never servile, the relationship between them developing into genuine familial affection rather than obligation. When Elena went into labor on a snowy December evening, Dante remained by her side through every contraction and moment of pain, his hands steady and his voice calm despite the terror Elena could see flickering in his eyes whenever he thought she wasn't watching. The birth of their daughter, Isabella Sofia Moretti, was the culmination of a journey that had transformed them both in ways they were still discovering. Holding their child for the first time, Elena marveled at the tiny perfect features that combined elements of both parents into something entirely new and beautiful. Isabella had Dante's dark hair and Elena's delicate bone structure, but her eyes were entirely her own, a striking blue-gray that seemed to take in everything with curious intelligence. "She's perfect," Dante whispered, his fingers stroking gently across their daughter's tiny hand as she gripped him with surprising strength. "She's absolutely perfect." Elena looked up at her husband, noting the tears he didn't bother to hide and the overwhelming joy that transformed his features into something almost sacred. The man who had commanded fear and respect throughout the city was completely undone by the small person they had created together, and Elena felt her heart expand with love for both of them. 1 year later, Elena stood in the same spot before the office windows where she had accepted Dante's proposal, but now she held Isabella against her shoulder while their daughter babbled happily and reached for the sparkling city lights below. The business had continued to grow and prosper under their joint leadership, and Elena had discovered a talent for strategic planning that complemented Dante's instinctive understanding of power dynamics. Their home was filled with laughter and warmth. The sterile elegance of Dante's bachelor penthouse transformed into a space that welcomed family and friends with equal comfort. Sofia was a frequent visitor during school breaks, her relationship with her brother-in-law deepening into genuine affection and respect that pleased Elena more than any formal gratitude could have. "You know," Dante said, entering the office and moving to stand beside his wife and daughter, "I used to think love was a weakness that made men careless and vulnerable." Elena turned to smile at him, noting the way Isabella immediately reached for her father with delighted squeaks of recognition. "And now," she asked, shifting their daughter into his waiting arms. "Now I know that love is what makes everything else worth protecting," Dante replied, kissing the top of Isabella's head before drawing Elena close with his free arm. "You didn't just give me an heir, Elena. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to build something beautiful instead of just surviving from day to day." As they stood together watching the city lights twinkle below, Elena reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. What had begun as a desperate transaction had grown into the kind of love story she had never dared to hope for, complete with partnership and passion and the promise of decades still to unfold together. Isabella gurgled happily in her father's arms, reaching tiny hands toward the lights, as if she already understood that this bright and beautiful world belonged to her through the love and determination of parents who had fought for the right to build it together. "I love you," Elena said quietly, the words carrying all the weight of choice and commitment and daily decision to cherish what they had created. "I love you too," Dante replied, his voice warm with the certainty of a man who had found his home in the hearts of his family rather than the walls of any building. Have you ever experienced a love that transformed your entire understanding of what was possible in your own life? Elena and Dante had discovered that the most beautiful futures sometimes grow from the most impossible beginnings, and their daughter would inherit a legacy built on courage, partnership, and the unwavering belief that love can conquer any obstacle when two people choose each other every single day.